And Dr. Bates Gill is the Chief Executive of the United States Studies Centre at Sydney University. He's with me now in the studio. Dr. Gill, thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
What stood out for you in this State of the Union address as the most pressing issue?
Well, for the President, obviously, was to push harder, even past his effort during the election, to try and carve out a space for him and his agenda for the middle class. And to paint, I think, although in this particular speech, not explicitly but implicitly, paint the Republican Party as the party representing everyone, the rich, representing the upper class, representing the wealthy and the well-off.
He mentioned the middle class so many times. Can you give us an insight into what it is like living in that middle class at the moment in the United States?
Well, it's clearly not going well. In spite of some of the numbers that the President touted in the speech, obviously there are still big difficulties in terms of finding sustained employment, and maybe at its root a sense of uncertainty about the future, not only about those at the working level, but even worse, what their children might face going forward. He's trying to tap into that. His election strategy proved successful in doing so. And I think this speech represents a continued effort to try and press that case.
Can you give us an idea about how the State of the Union address actually works? Obviously, he delivers it to Congress. After that is when, say, the Republicans are going to come out and say, no, don't agree with this, don't agree with that. What's the kind of momentum behind that?
It's a quirky thing. It actually exists in the U.S. Constitution. It's required that the President present information about the State of the Union. It doesn't say in the Constitution how often. It doesn't say how it should be done. And this sort of annual ritual, as it's become now, a high-profile, globally televised event, is actually relatively new as a way of the President to get his ideas and his agenda forward.
How much impact does it have on policy decisions? Does Congress sit there and think, yeah, you know what, you've got a point to make there, let's come to the table on climate change, let's change tax breaks for the rich, whatever it might be? Does it actually have an effect?
My sense of the environment in Washington today is everyone's pretty cynical about this. Yes, it can have an impact. Interestingly, the President's numbers in terms of approval do not move that much as a result of the State of the Union address. But don't forget, the four freedoms of Roosevelt, the war on poverty of Lyndon Johnson, and the axis of evil of George W. Bush were all phrases, essentially policies, which were first put forward as part of the State of the Union address. So it can have an impact in telling us the direction that the President wishes to go.
You mentioned that axis of evil of George W. Bush, so much a foreign policy State of the Union address then. This one's so much focused on domestic economy, particularly in job creation. How much of this address do you think would have been watched by leaders around the world, and would they have seen, I guess, a slimmer version of foreign policy mentioned in the address and made judgments on that?
Obviously, different times. The Axis of Evil speech was a mere 6 or 7 months after the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And today, as the President has repeatedly said, we have to do our work at home in the United States, rebuild ourselves at home. So I suspect that this has already been signaled. Foreign leaders probably understand that. To the degree they were watching, maybe just waiting to hear what they might say about a few particular issues, North Korea, Iran, what's going to happen in Afghanistan. I don't think anyone expected this speech to be about foreign policy, and it wasn't.
The setup of the speech, again, in the Congress there, you've got the Vice President sitting behind Barack Obama, you've got the Speaker of the House, John Boehner. Now, John Boehner tweeted quite a lot after the address, quite critical, being a Republican, quite critical of the ideas that Obama laid out on the table. How does that dynamic work in the House?
Well, it's not unusual at all in this new era of technology that we'd see that kind of quick reaction, responsiveness. And again, very different from the way the State of the Union has been traditionally done. This is a whole new world. But his presence there is because he is the leader of the House. The Vice President's presence there is because he, in fact, by the Constitution, is the head of the Senate. They are there representing the fact that the President must come to the Congress to give information about the State of the Union. That's the dynamic. It's mandated by the Constitution. At the end of the day, it's not the President telling the Congress what to do. It is the President asking the Congress to please help.
He asked them about the deficit. He mentioned that he was going to try and reduce that deficit to $4 trillion over the next decade. He mentioned that he'd saved about $2.5 trillion, so that leaves about $1.5 trillion. Is that doable?
Well, you know, honestly, the way the president presented this speech, one would think it's not. Most of what he presented in the speech was what his critics certainly would call more government spending. The president would look at that differently, but he did not give a lot of ideas about how the deficit is going to be cut, except, again, the ideas that he's put forward before, to raise taxes on the best off in the country.
Dr. Gill, climate change also was a big part of his speech. He'd mentioned that it was pretty much the time to act. I noted that he failed to get global warming bill through Congress when both houses were controlled by the Democrats in 2010. So how likely is it that any action will be taken? And Obama did mention that he would take executive action if there was no consensus.
I would not put a lot of hope in the expectation that the United States is going to be a breakthrough leader on climate change. If anything, a more realistic approach, I think, was something he said about how the country is going to increasingly be reliant and more independent from the fact that the United States is now becoming a natural gas producer and even exporter. And the only hopes there for climate change mitigation would be investment in technologies that can bring down the carbon footprint of that newfound technology and energy source.
Very interesting time, Dr. Bates Gill. Thank you so much for joining us tonight in the studio.
Thank you.